There's a lot of hardware news this week. This is our second news video already for the week. So obviously 1070 Ti is one of them. We're going to focus a little less on that because we kind of already detailed some of it. There's Ryzen APU with Vega inclusion news that's kind of interesting. And AMD Q3 earnings, Intel AVX 512 support for Cannon Lake, PCIe 4.0 spec finalization, and then a couple of new products on the market from Asus and Corsair. Before getting to that, this content is brought to you by the Thermaltake Flow RGB closed loop liquid cooler, which is a 360mm radiator plus 3 120 fans that are RGB illuminated. The Thermaltake rain fans at that. This uses a 4.5 Gen Asetek pump, which is one of the faster pumps. You can learn more at the link in the description below. The 1070 Ti will start us off. That was officially announced yesterday at the time of filming, and we primed that announcement with our teardown of the Vulcan X card from Colorful. We also posted the specs on the website along with the release date, which is November 2nd. The 1070 Ti fills an odd position on the market, much like the 950, the 950 once did. And it uses the same GPU 104 as the 1080 and the 1070. The GPU, though, is a cut-down 1080, running 19 SMs instead of 20, and SMs have 128 CUDA cores per SM, so it's just a couple CUDA cores lower than a 1080, basically. This one is branded as GP 104-300, the 1080 was GP 104-400, the 1070 is GP 104-200, and it slots obviously between those two. 19 SMs at 128 CUDA cores per SM puts the 1070 Ti at 2432 shaders, where the GTX 1080 runs 2560 shaders and the 1070 runs 1920. That means that the 1070 Ti is much closer to a 1080 in performance than a 1070, and that's doubly the case when considering a reference TDP of 180 watts. Power budget will vary per board as usual, and will be the biggest player in determining overclocking power budget headroom. We'll look into that more in the future as we get more cards though. As for other specs, the 1070 Ti loses 8 texture map units and 1 TPC along with its amputated SM, but keeps the ROP count and the memory capacity. The memory, however, is different, using GDDR5 8 gigabit per second rather than G5X 10 gigabits per second, resulting in a memory bandwidth deficit of 64 gigabytes per second on the Ti. Lower, that is, not total. Clocks are marked at 1607 MHz base, the same as the 1080 and 1683 boost. The boost clock is 50 MHz lower than the GTX 1080s, and partner cards will be forced to ship at the same base and boost clock as NVIDIA's reference card. This means that out-of-box performance will be functionally the same, thermal or power limitations of course notwithstanding, and will fall to user overclocking to overcome, which is actually permitted, by the way. This is clearly a move that's attempting to counter AMD's Vega 56, which is definitely AMD's strongest Vega card that's shipped. Vega 56 more or less usurps Vega 64, and in the process, Frontier Edition. So it's been the one card we've pointed to out of the Vega family where we've said this thing actually competes pretty damn well with the GTX 1070, which MSRP to MSRP is the direct competitor. Obviously, that's not how things panned out because of the market and it's how unpredictable it is right now. Vega still has pricing and availability issues. The partner cards haven't made it yet. Even the Asus one that we technically have is not even ready for review. So Vega is still waiting, which means that this is an opportune time for NVIDIA to push out a 1070 Ti. And what they're trying to do here is to keep the market attention on NVIDIA products. So while the 1070 Ti doesn't really make much sense from a consumer standpoint, not all of them can exist. You kind of either have a 1070 Ti or a 1080, and it's more likely going to be one or the other, not both cards existing at the same time because the price is so close, but we'll find out in the review. But the point is that the discussion now will be, well, why would you buy X when you could buy Y instead of why would you buy a 1070 when you could buy a Vega 56? It's going to be why would you buy a 1070 or a 1080 when you could buy a Ti, or why would you buy a Ti when you could buy a 1080 or a 1070? So Vega 56 starts to fall out of the argument. I think that's what NVIDIA is going for more than actual just straight sales of the 1070 Ti. It seems more like a keeping attention on the 3 cards that they have all grouped and clustered around the 56. Which, from that aspect, we'll see if it works. We'll see how the 1070 Ti does in benchmarking and the review, which will be out along with the release of the card November 2nd. So keep an eye out for that one. Next up, AMD officially announced its Raven Ridge APU alongside the 1070 Ti on the same day within an hour of each other. The Raven Ridge APU is a quad-core CPU with a single CCX, Ryzen of course, and a Vega IGP jointly bridged by AMD's Infinity Fabric interconnect. The CPU and GPU can directly communicate by the interconnect, which does mean that, like all other APUs, faster memory is going to benefit the Raven Ridge APU. We lose some cache with Raven Ridge versus the usual Ryzen Zeppelins, but also gain the IGP and a modular structure for the CPU as a whole, as opposed to one where the components are tighter together. A total of 640 streaming processors are present on the 10 Vega CUs, which should be coupled with high-speed memory for best effect. Raven Ridge's IMC supports 3200 MHz memory maximally, and AMD did provide some of its internal benchmarks for the APU, though note that the Overwatch one is at a 79% render scale of 720p, which functionally equates an iPhone 5 display at 1136 by 640. Regardless, the rest of the numbers have promise for instances where a cheap, discrete GPU isn't an option. We'll look into this when we have the product in hand and a chance, but it'd be reasonable to assume performance would be similar to a low-end R5 GPU, not the CPUs, but the older R5 GPUs, or a low-end 700 series desktop GPU, maybe something like a 750 or a 550 or something like that. As for AMD's mobile processors, those include the Ryzen 7 2700U, now with higher XFR headroom, and the R5 2500U. AMD also posted its Q3 earnings, keeping with the AMD news for a moment. This reported a $71 million net income for the quarter, so they are technically in the black now. And for perspective, Q3 of 2016, last year's reportings for the same period, had AMD negative $406 million for the same metric. So to go from negative 406 to plus 71 looks pretty good. The Q2 2017 earnings, also for perspective, posted a $16 million loss, GAAP or GAAP. AMD has increased its gross margins to 35% from 33%, up from 5% in second quarter 2016. And the company reported a $1.6 billion revenue. Last quarter, the company reported a revenue of $1.2 billion, relatively stagnant if looking at third quarter 2016 as well. Earnings per share are also out of the negatives now at 7 cents per share. And of its revenue, AMD reports $819 million from computing and graphics, which includes both GPU and CPU divisions on the desktop side primarily. And another $824 million comes from enterprise, embedded, and semi-custom solutions, where AMD was focusing for a while when it did its whole 5 pillars thing. Looking at cash flow and total debt, AMD still has a long fight ahead, even though it was a pretty good quarter for them. As of June 2017, AMD has a 77% to 23% debt to equity split, or a ratio of 3.4. For reference, Intel's ratio is 0.47 and NVIDIA's is 0.35. AMD is on an uptrend from Ryzen and semi-custom solutions though, which is good news overall. They just have to keep it up going into next year. One final note here, there's been some issues reported with Vega and Destiny 2, some specific levels in the game. AMD's aware of the issues, as is Bungie, and both of them are working to resolve them. AMD tells us that it's the highest possible priority. Bungie has also reported that they're working with AMD to try and troubleshoot why the game crashes on, I think it's Mission 6, with the Vega cards. So that may even be resolved by the time this video goes up, because they're both looking into it now as we speak. So good news there for Destiny players with Vega. Hopefully it gets fixed soon, and we will post a short news article on the website once it is. That way, if you've stopped playing, you can find it and know it's time to play again. Intel's next. So AVX 512 for Cannon Lake was in the news. This was a story over on AnandTech where they talked about the Intel purported inclusion of AVX 512 for Cannon Lake, which is Intel's upcoming 10 nanometer architecture slated for next year. It was delayed out of this year. And that looks like it's going to be new instructions from the Xeon Skylake chips, including integer fused multiply add commands. And as AnandTech points out, AVX 512 support coming to Cannon Lake indicates larger caches and increased memory bandwidth, but we don't yet know which Cannon Lake CPUs will support AVX 512. It just is in Intel's programming reference document that you can get online. This isn't much of a consumer feature today, but it's worth keeping an eye on to see if they have plans otherwise. The next news story we've been following for a little while, it's PCIe 4.0. So PCIe SIG has now released version 1.0 of the spec. Last time we spoke of it, it was 0.9 that was released. And PCIe SIG, the group responsible for the PCIe interface, is fast tracking both Gen 4 and Gen 5. Gen 5 is supposed to be shipping, well, not shipping, the spec should be done for Gen 5 in 2019. And then obviously you've got a bit of a latency there before it's picked up and actually on motherboard. So it probably won't be 2019. But the spec for 4.0 has hit version 1 now. And the takeaway here, same as it has been, PCIe Gen 4 effectively doubles the bandwidth per lane. So if you have an X8 slot of Gen 4, it would carry the same bandwidth as an X16 or a BY16 slot on Gen 3. And that means that theoretically, if you're in a bandwidth limited scenario or you're in a lane limited scenario, you could run graphics cards on BY8. And if you're not exceeding bandwidth on BY16 3.0, which you're probably not, definitely not, then you won't exceed it on BY8 4.0. So you could run that, and then you save your other lanes for other things like dual NVMe SSDs or whatever the case may be. So that's the main takeaway there. BY16 with Gen 4, just to give an idea, will have about 31.5 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, so roughly double of what the PCIe 3.0 does. Finally, for new products for the week, Asus has their new Expedition A320M motherboard for the AM4 platform. The Asus motherboard targets East Asia markets primarily with an anti-humidity coating and memory locking mechanisms to prevent theft, and that's because they are targeting internet cafes and PC banes in Korea. The Expedition A320M has a joint that locks the back of the motherboard to the memory slots, which prevents the memory socket from opening without a screwdriver. The motherboard is specifically built for iCafes, and it plans to fight damage and corrosion from humidity with a coating on the board. The Expedition runs a 6-phase VRM off of the EPS 12-volt power and hosts a single PCIe BY16 slot. And the Expedition is mostly noteworthy for its insane color scheme. It's starting to look more like ASRock than Asus at this point. The anti-humidity thing is also kind of an ASRock feature. So looking like that. I don't know if we'll see it in the West, but it's a new board from Asus and it's got a couple of interesting features in the least. And then the last item, Corsair slaps tempered glass onto the Spec 04. So that's, I mean, it's a Spec 04 with glass on it. That's what it is. We reviewed the Spec 04. If you're interested in the Spec 04 with glass, read the Spec 04 review and then pretend that we said it had tempered glass on it, and that's the opinion. It's the same thing. So check that out if you're interested in that one. Otherwise, as always, subscribe for more. You can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. Reviews of this thing will be live within the next week or so. And thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.